He said, "Stop asking for help. It makes you look weak." He didn't raise his voice, didn't scold me outright. He just leaned closer in the pharmacy line and whispered it like a secret, like something shameful that shouldn't be heard by strangers. I remember the way his eyes darted toward the young woman behind the counter, as if I might embarrass him simply by existing. By standing there with my purse open, trying to read the screen that told me how much I still owed for my medication. I didn't argue. I never do when he lowers his voice like that, because that tone doesn't invite answers. It cancels them. I nodded, smiled faintly, and said something about the light being too bright in here, pretending my eyes were the problem and not the situation. That was 3 months ago, and it hasn't left me since. I'm 79 years old, and that single sentence, "Stop asking for help," felt like a verdict, as if the act of needing anyone at my age had become some kind of moral failure, a public sin. When I came home that afternoon, I placed the paper bag with my medicine on the counter and stared at it like it was evidence of something. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, though it's already small, just one window above the sink, a counter chipped in 2 places, and a fridge that hums louder than a confession. I made tea, the kind my late husband used to say smelled like boiled grass, and I sat at the table that wobbles when you lean on it. The apartment is quiet except for the clock, and even that seems hesitant these days. There was a time when the sound of the clock meant something, when I measured my days by who called, who needed me, who depended on me. I used to run a whole household once, 3 bedrooms, a husband, a son, and all their scattered needs. And I managed fine. Now I manage silence. I moved here 2 years ago after Daniel, my son, decided that keeping me in the little guest house behind his own property was becoming too much to maintain. He said it kindly at first, in that careful managerial tone he's perfected, the one that sounds like empathy but has no warmth behind it. He and his wife, Lisa, helped me pack, if you can call it that. They stood around giving instructions while I folded decades of life into a few boxes, and Lisa kept saying, "This will be better for you, Marianne, more independent. You'll feel freer." Independence, that's the word people use when they want you out of the way. My new place was small but clean, and at first I tried to believe them. I told myself I'd finally have time to read, to tend to the little balcony plants, to rest. But freedom without connection is just exile. And after a while, you can feel the edges of that freedom cutting into you, thin but deep. Every week I used to visit their house to see the baby, my only granddaughter, a delicate girl with pale curls who smelled like powder and milk. Lisa was always polite, too polite, as if every minute she spent in my company was a test of her manners. I would sit on the edge of their white sofa, holding the child carefully so I wouldn't drop her, because there was always a sense in that house that things could break too easily. Porcelain, peace, or patience. Once, when I offered to help with laundry, Lisa smiled without looking at me and said, "Oh no, Marianne, you just relax. We've got a system." She always said that, "We've got a system." As if my presence might throw off the calibration of her perfect self-sustaining household. It started small, the withdrawal. First it was Daniel not calling for weeks, then forgetting to drive me to my appointments, then the missed birthdays. He still sent money sometimes, a quiet transfer from our joint account, but even that began to feel like hush money. I would open my online banking page, see the little deposit, and think, there it is, the cost of keeping me invisible. But I didn't say anything. I thought, maybe he's stressed, maybe it's just a phase, maybe the world has worn him down in ways I can't see. Mothers are skilled at forgiving what hasn't been asked to be forgiven. We do it by habit, by muscle memory. The day he told me to stop asking for help was a small moment, but moments are what kill you, not the grand events. He'd come to drive me to the pharmacy because the bus schedule had changed and the heat had been unbearable that week. I was grateful. I'd even baked him a small lemon loaf wrapped in wax paper. But the whole drive, he barely spoke, just scrolled through messages at the red lights, sighing. When we arrived, he parked and said, "I'll wait in the car." I think that's when I realized something had shifted permanently. He used to come inside with me, used to carry the bags. Now, even my pace embarrassed him. When the pharmacist asked me to confirm my address, I stumbled over the zip code. Mine and his had switched so many times since the move, and that's when he came in, irritated, hissed that line, "Stop asking for help." It wasn't about the zip code. It was about the fact that I existed in a way that reflected poorly on the life he'd built. My age had become a mirror he didn't want to see himself in. After that, I began to notice the small rejections accumulating like dust. When I called to ask if I could visit, he'd say, "This weekend's crazy," or "Maybe next week we're swamped." When I texted Lisa to ask about the baby, she'd send a picture but never a time to come over. One evening, I dropped off a small envelope at their mailbox, a check to help with the baby's daycare, a silly gesture, really, because I still felt the need to prove I was useful. It was never cashed. I found it torn in half later when Lisa sent me a bag of old mail she said had piled up at their house. I didn't mention it. Some humiliations lose their sting when you stop expecting fairness. People talk about aging as a softening, a gentle fading. But the truth is, it's a process of erosion. Little by little, the world takes back its attention, its patience, its space for you. And if you're not careful, you start believing you deserve that shrinking. You start calling it normal. That's what I had done for years. Normalized being sidelined, edited, tolerated. I'd turned gratitude into an apology I never stopped repeating. But after that pharmacy day, something in me began to harden. Not with anger exactly, but with clarity. I started keeping records again, old habits from my years at the clinic where I worked the reception desk. I wrote down dates, payments, calls, missed calls. I logged every automatic deduction, every forgotten reimbursement, every shared bill that somehow stopped being shared. I wasn't planning revenge then, only reassurance. Proof that I hadn't imagined any of it. Because when you're treated like you're losing your grip, the first thing you begin to doubt is your own perception. At night, I'd sit by the window, listening to the hum of the traffic below, and I'd wonder if Daniel ever looked back on the woman who had carried him through the lean years. I used to work double shifts so he could attend the private high school he swore he hated, but later bragged about in college essays. I paid for his first apartment, co-signed his first loan, and when his father died, I didn't crumble. I became both mother and father without ever asking for applause. And yet here I was, being told that asking for help made me weak. The irony didn't even sting. It just confirmed the quiet truth that love, when unreciprocated long enough, calcifies into obligation for one party and inconvenience for the other. A week after the pharmacy, I received a notice from the power company addressed to primary account holder Daniel Cross. I blinked at it, confused. I'd been paying the bill since moving here, automatically from the shared account. I called the helpline, and the woman on the phone told me cheerfully that the primary holder had changed last month at the account holder's request. So what exactly? I asked. A secondary, she said, as if that word weren't heavy. I hung up, my hand trembling only slightly. I didn't call Daniel. I knew what he'd say. "You're overreacting, Mom." That night, I opened the drawer where I keep my old papers. Among them was the folder from the credit union, the joint account, the one I'd opened decades ago so we could manage family expenses more easily after his father's surgery. It had survived 3 moves, 2 deaths, and 1 disillusionment. I took it out, smoothed the pages, and saw what I hadn't allowed myself to see. My name was still there, first, then his, second. The account was legally mine. The next morning, I decided to check the balance. I don't know what I expected, maybe emptiness, maybe confirmation that I'd been erased in more ways than one, but what I found wasn't nothing. It was plenty, enough to remind me that invisibility doesn't mean powerlessness, that a woman dismissed is still a woman with choices, even if she's been told otherwise. I didn't plan anything dramatic that morning. I just made coffee, buttered a piece of toast, and wrote a list on the back of an old envelope: banks, bills, contacts. My handwriting shook slightly, but the intent behind it didn't. There are moments in a woman's life when she realizes the story isn't over just because someone else stopped reading it. That morning, I realized mine wasn't over. I was just beginning to edit. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, was about to find out that the person he told to stop asking for help had finally learned how to help herself. He didn't answer my call that evening. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail, the same clipped, efficient recording that sounded like a business memo rather than a son's voice. I left a message anyway, something light. Just wanted to make sure the transfer went through, dear, and to ask if the baby liked the sweater I sent. I knew he wouldn't call back, but I said it for the record, to prove I was still trying. The next morning, I went to the mailbox and found a thick envelope from the bank. The paper smelled faintly of toner and neglect. Inside was a new policy statement and, tucked among the pages, a notice confirming that authorized joint access had been modified. My name was still listed, but the contact email had been changed to his. That was the first real sign, the one I couldn't explain away with excuses or fatigue or misunderstanding. He had taken control of the account, quietly, methodically, without a word to me. I sat at the table, reading the line twice, then again, until the words blurred. It wasn't just a banking update. It was a declaration. You don't need to be informed anymore. Later that afternoon, I tried to call him again, this time from the small community phone booth downstairs, because my cell service had been spotty. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his tone already defensive, like he'd been expecting a confrontation. Mom, please, I'm in the middle of something. What's wrong now? I told him about the notice, that I simply wanted to understand. There was a pause, and then he sighed that long, theatrical sigh I used to scold him for when he was a boy. It's just easier for me to handle it. You get confused with all that online stuff. I'm saving you trouble. I wanted to believe him, but saving me trouble has always been his way of saving himself from responsibility. I said softly that I'd prefer to have the updates come to both of us, and that's when his voice sharpened. Mom, I can't keep doing this, answering calls about every little bill. You've got to stop acting like you can't manage. It's exhausting. I didn't say what I wanted to say. That exhaustion was something I'd earned the right to after 79 years of service to everyone but myself. Instead, I said, I'm sorry, I just thought... But he cut me off. Please, just stop asking for help, okay? It's not good for you. It makes people uncomfortable. That sentence stayed in my ear long after he hung up. Not good for who? For me? Or for the people who preferred not to be reminded that aging doesn't make you invisible. It only makes you inconvenient. I sat there with the phone pressed to my chest until the line went dead, and then I replaced it gently, as if the receiver itself might bruise. Outside, The sun was dissolving into that dusty amber light we get in late summer, the kind that makes everything look both fragile and eternal. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could still look beautiful while something inside you quietly collapsed. The next day, I went to the pharmacy alone. The bus was late, the driver impatient, and my knees ached so much that each step up the curb felt like climbing a small mountain. Still, I managed. I smiled at the clerk, paid an exact change, and carried the paper bag like a medal of endurance. On my way home, I passed by a small cafe, one I hadn't noticed before, and for a moment I considered going in. I used to love the ritual of coffee shops, the small talk, the clatter of cups, the feeling of being part of the hum of life. But when I looked through the window, I saw tables full of people with laptops, young faces turned away, eyes fixed on screens. Not a single one looked up. I walked on. When I got back to my building, there was a note taped to my door from management, an overdue balance for utilities. I knew it couldn't be right. The payments came directly from the joint account. But when I called to ask, the clerk told me the last payment had been declined. Insufficient authorization, she said. I told her I'd sort it out and hung up. For the first time in a long while, I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the cold precision of clarity. This wasn't carelessness. It was control, a quiet erasure disguised as efficiency. I'd been cut off from the very systems that were supposed to sustain me, and the worst part was that it had been done in the language of protection. That night, I couldn't sleep. I made tea, then another, then gave up on the pretense of calm and opened the folder again. The account statements, the deeds, the scraps of a life spent documenting everyone else's needs. There it was in black and white. My savings, once shared, now rerouted through permissions I hadn't granted. I thought of calling the bank to dispute it, but I knew what would happen. They'd put me on hold, transfer me 3 times, and ask if my son could verify the changes on my behalf. The same pattern as always. The mother becomes the dependent becomes the child, and the child becomes the gatekeeper. It's a quiet reversal that happens so slowly you don't even realize you've been demoted. The following morning, I went to visit Daniel and Lisa. I didn't warn them. I just took the early bus and walked the last 3 blocks in the heat. Their house looked the same. Clean lines, manicured hedges, the same expensive calm that seems to radiate from people who believe appearances are virtues. Lisa opened the door, surprise flickering across her face before she smiled that polite smile of hers. "Marianne, what a surprise. Daniel's working from home, but I'll let him know you're here." She led me to the kitchen, all stainless steel and marble, a room that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and disinterest. "Can I get you some water? Sparkling?" she asked. I said no, and she nodded as if I'd complicated her morning. When Daniel came in, he looked startled, then irritated. "Mom, you should have called." I told him I needed to speak in person about the account. He glanced at Lisa, then at his watch, the way people do when they're looking for an escape hatch. "Mom, this isn't a good time." "It's never a good time, Daniel," I said, my voice steady but low. I told him what the clerk had said about the declined payment, the updated contact information, the missing transfers. His expression tightened. "I told you I took over handling things. You're overcomplicating it." "By existing?" I asked quietly. He blinked. "By worrying. You've got to let go of this control thing." That made me laugh, softly, without humor. I told him control was something I'd spent my whole life giving away. To him, to his father, to the rules that said women like me should be grateful for scraps of attention. "I'm not trying to fight you," I said finally. "I just want what's mine." He crossed his arms. This is exactly what I mean. You turn everything into drama. You can't just trust that I'm looking out for you. I wanted to ask him when looking out for someone became synonymous with excluding them, but I didn't. I simply nodded, as if conceding a point I didn't believe in. Lisa stood behind him the whole time, silent, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, as though to steady him, though I suspect it was more to remind me where her allegiance lay. When I left, she followed me to the door. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said softly. "Try not to take things personally." I wanted to tell her that pressure is not an excuse for cruelty, but I only said, "I raised him to handle pressure." She looked down, embarrassed, and said nothing more. That evening, as the bus carried me back through the haze of late traffic, I watched the streets blur by and thought about how betrayal never arrives in a single act. It comes in installments, small, subtle payments toward a final balance of indifference. By the time the bus reached my stop, I had made up my mind. The next morning, I went to the credit union myself. The lobby was cool and quiet, the kind of institutional calm that feels rehearsed. A young teller greeted me, polite but distracted. I explained that I wanted to review a joint account. She asked for my ID, my signature, my patience. After a few keystrokes, she frowned slightly. "It looks like your son requested primary access 2 months ago." I asked if that was allowed without my consent. She hesitated. "Technically, no, but sometimes systems update if there's a co-signer with a verified digital ID. It's messy." Messy, yes. That's what happens when a lifetime of trust collides with paperwork. I asked her to print the last 3 statements. She did, carefully, perhaps sensing something in my tone. When she handed them to me, she said quietly, "You should probably change your password." I thanked her and left. I sat in the small park across the street, the papers spread across my lap. There it was, withdrawals I hadn't made, transfers I hadn't approved, notes labeled maintenance and consulting. My son had been using the account like a private reservoir, dipping into it when he needed, assuming I'd never check. The shock was not in the discovery, but in the absence of surprise. Somewhere deep down, I'd known. Mothers often do. That was the day the air changed for me. The betrayal wasn't a lightning strike. It was a long, slow burn finally reaching the nerve. I folded the papers, placed them back in the envelope, and held it against my chest like something both sacred and poisonous. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply sat there and breathed, long and even, until the trembling in my hands subsided. The catalyst wasn't his theft or his lies. It was the realization that I'd been living as if I needed permission to exist. That evening, I went home, turned on the lamp by my chair, and took out my old address book. There was one number I hadn't used in years, Lisa's office line. I wrote it neatly on a new envelope. The next morning, I scanned the bank statement, attached it to an email, and typed 3 words in the subject line, "For your records." Then I clicked send. That was all. No message, no explanation, no plea. Just truth, sent quietly into their perfect, curated life like a crack in glass. It didn't shatter yet, but I could already hear the sound beginning. The silence after I sent that email was almost theatrical, as if the world had taken a breath and was waiting to see what kind of woman I would become next. For 2 days, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, not even one of Lisa's perfectly phrased texts that always began with, "Just checking in." I kept the radio on to fill the apartment with sound, but it only made the stillness louder. By the 3rd morning, I started to believe maybe she hadn't seen it. Maybe it had slipped into her spam folder. Maybe the universe was giving them a chance to pretend nothing had happened. But then, at 10:14 a.m., My phone lit up with Daniel's name. I didn't pick up. I just watched the screen pulse with his number like a heartbeat I no longer shared. It rang 6 times before stopping, and then the voicemail icon blinked. The message was brief, sharp around the edges, and spoken in the voice of a man rehearsing authority. "Mom, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is not okay. Call me back immediately." He didn't say please. He didn't ask if I was all right. He said immediately, as if I still answered to him. I didn't, not anymore. I poured myself coffee, added too much milk, and drank it anyway. The mug trembled a little in my hand, not from fear, but from something else, something closer to the thrill of defiance. I wasn't sure what I expected from sending that file. Perhaps just a flicker of shame in Lisa's immaculate world. A moment when she'd look at him differently, when the truth would stain their white kitchen like a drop of ink. But what I got was silence, then fury. Later that afternoon, a new email appeared in my inbox. It was from Daniel, subject line. "You've crossed a line." The message itself was short. "Mom, I don't know why you'd want to cause trouble between Lisa and me, but this kind of thing isn't healthy. I've been handling your finances for your own good. You need to trust me. Please don't do anything like that again." It was the please that undid me, because it wasn't a plea. It was a command dressed as concern. I didn't reply. I printed the email instead, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same folder as the bank statements. Paper has weight, screens don't. And I needed the weight of evidence, something real, something that wouldn't disappear with a click. The following days blurred together. The routine, coffee, mail, the quiet hum of my neighbor's television through the wall took on a strange brightness, as if ordinary life had grown more vivid now that something secret had cracked open beneath it. I started taking evening walks again, slow circuits around the block, greeting the same dog walkers, the same woman who watered her geraniums every night at 7. People nodded to me politely. None of them knew that somewhere, a perfect little marriage was trembling under the weight of my small act of rebellion. On the 5th day, Lisa showed up. She didn't call first. I heard the knock and knew instantly it was her, because it was too careful, too polite, 3 measured taps that sounded rehearsed. I opened the door, and there she was, hair tied back, sunglasses still on, holding a grocery bag like an apology. "Marianne," she said softly, "I was in the area. No one is ever just in the area when they live 20 minutes away." I stepped aside, motioning her in. The apartment must have looked modest to her, all faded upholstery and crooked picture frames, the smell of coffee and something faintly medicinal. She placed the bag on the counter, fruit, a carton of soup, bread wrapped in brown paper, and turned to me. "You look good," she said, which is what people say when they're about to deliver bad news. We sat at the table. She didn't touch her coffee, though I'd poured it for her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with that same perfect poise she uses at neighborhood functions, she began. "Daniel's been very upset. He said you sent me something unexpected." I nodded. "Yes, I thought you should be aware of the account details, since they involve both of us in a way." She blinked, a slow, deliberate movement, as if measuring how much of the truth she could afford to see. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," she said. "Daniel's only trying to help." That word again. Help. I smiled faintly. Help is something you offer, not something you enforce. She looked at me then, really looked, her expression briefly unguarded. "He worries about you, about how you've been coping." I wanted to ask what she thought coping meant. Paying my bills, feeding myself, Staying quiet so my existence didn't inconvenience anyone? Instead, I said, he's done a very good job making sure I have no reason to bother him. She didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the parking lot where my old car sat, a little rust around the edges, but still running. You could have called me, she said. We could have talked. We're talking now, I replied, and she flinched slightly, as if I'd broken some unspoken rule of civility. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Daniel asked me to give you this, she said. It was a printed form, a power of attorney renewal, my name already typed in. I unfolded it slowly, the air thick between us. He just wants to make sure everything's in order, she added. I set it down on the table. Tell him it's perfectly in order, I said quietly. Tell him I'm still capable of signing my own name. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. There was a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or fear, but it passed quickly. He doesn't mean to upset you, she murmured. He just wants what's best. I almost laughed. What's best for whom? That was the first time she didn't have an answer ready. The silence stretched. Then she stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse like someone preparing to re-enter her curated life. You know, she said softly, you've always had a way of making him feel small. I stared at her. Maybe he is small, I said, not cruelly, just truthfully. Her lips parted, then closed. She picked up her bag, left the groceries on the counter, and walked out without another word. After she left, I stood for a long time by the window, watching her cross the lot and get into her car. She sat there for a moment, probably texting him, and then drove off. The sun had started to set, streaking the sky with colors too beautiful for such an ugly day. I felt oddly calm, not victorious, not angry, just still. I'd been erased quietly for years. Now I was beginning to reappear, even if only as a problem in someone else's narrative. And there's a strange power in being the problem. People have to acknowledge your existence again. The next morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number, a woman's voice, warm but professional. Mrs. Cross? This is Angela from the Senior Services Office. We received a request from your son about reviewing your care plan. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't submit any request, I said. She hesitated. It came from your listed guardian. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat down. Guardian. The word stung worse than thief. He hadn't just taken my money. He was trying to take my autonomy, one polite signature at a time. I pulled the phone toward me, opened my emails, and found a message from him sent that morning. Mom, please cooperate with Angela. This is for your safety. You're not thinking clearly lately, and Lisa and I just want to make sure you're taken care of. For a few seconds, my hands trembled so violently I could hardly type. Then something inside me went very still. I clicked reply and wrote, Daniel, I appreciate your concern. I am perfectly capable of managing my own life. Do not involve agencies on my behalf again. Any further attempts to modify my legal status without my consent will be treated as fraud. I reread it twice, adjusted nothing, and pressed send. The message looked oddly formal on the screen, but that was the point. Emotion hadn't worked. Only documentation mattered now. I printed that too and added it to the folder. That night, I sat by the window with the lamp turned low and the folder open in my lap. The papers inside were just ink and numbers, but they represented something vast and invisible. Every time I'd been silenced, minimized, redirected toward gratitude instead of justice. My life had been reduced to polite phrases and financial footnotes, and for the first time, I felt the shape of that reduction. It was cold and heavy and unmistakable. I realized then that this was no misunderstanding. It was a slow excommunication from my own story, and I would not go quietly. The following week passed in uneasy calm. Daniel didn't call again. Lisa sent one text, "Hope you're feeling better," and I didn't answer. I went about my days with a strange, quiet energy, as if preparing for something I couldn't yet name. I paid my bills directly from the credit union, closed the old joint account, and opened a new one in my name only. The teller, a different girl this time, congratulated me on the decision. "It's good to stay independent," she said cheerfully, unaware of how much that word meant to me. Independence. The word that once felt like exile now felt like reclamation. I walked home with my new debit card tucked carefully in my wallet, the plastic warm from my hand. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. But the quiet didn't last. One morning, I found a letter slid under my door, not mailed but delivered by hand. I recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. Neat, disciplined, slightly slanted. Inside was a single line. "You're making a mistake that you can't take back." No greeting, no signature, just that. I held it up to the light, as if hidden between the words I might find the boy who used to run home from school, shouting for me to watch him climb the fence. The boy who used to say I was his favorite person in the world, but there was nothing left of him there. Only a man who feared losing control of the mother he no longer respected. I folded the letter, placed it in the folder, and whispered to no one. Then let it be a mistake, but let it be mine. I woke before the sun and lay still, listening to the apartment breathe, refrigerator humming, a neighbor's shower starting in the wall, the shy tick of the clock finding its courage. And I understood, with a kind of gentle astonishment, that the fear I had been mistaking for prudence had finally burned itself out, leaving something clearer in its place. Not bravado exactly, but a readiness to act without asking permission from the people who had grown used to my hesitation. So I rose, made coffee strong enough to argue with, and set the folder on the table like a map I finally intended to follow rather than merely admire. Then I dressed in my sturdiest shoes and took the early bus to the credit union because I wanted to arrive before the day learned my name and started making demands. The lobby was quiet in the purposeful way of places where decisions happen. The teller called me ma'am without tilting her head toward pity, and when I said I needed to review beneficiaries and primary contacts and to remove digital proxies that had been assigned without my consent, she didn't flinch or ask me to fetch a son to confirm my adulthood. She simply nodded and printed forms with the crisp assurance of paper that knows its authority. So I signed with the slow care of someone who understands that the hand is writing more than letters and dates. It is writing a border. And while she scanned my ID and verified my answers twice, I looked at my name on the screen, first position, not second, and felt the peculiar steadiness that arrives when a door you thought had rusted shut gives way under a deliberate push rather than a dramatic kick. From there, I went to the branch's small office with the glass walls that try and fail to keep privacy from looking delicate, and I asked to speak to a manager about a fraud alert and about closing the joint account in a manner that would document my choice beyond dispute. And a man with careful hair and good shoes ushered me in and spoke in the courteous tone reserved for people who might surprise you, which I suppose I did when I pulled out my folder and my list and the copy of the email to Lisa and told him, calmly and without apology, that any correspondence or attempt to restore my son's permissions would be contested, and that I wished to create a new, clearly named account with a simple structure I could manage without someone helping me off the edge of my own life. And when it was done, new card, new PIN, new statements addressed to me and me alone, I thanked him with the old-fashioned earnestness of a woman who has worked a front desk and knows the dignity of doing a job. Well, then I stepped back into the mild morning with a plastic card that felt heavier than logic could explain and lighter than shame had ever allowed. The senior center opened at 9, a low building with bulletin boards full of watercolor classes and fall prevention workshops, and notices with too many exclamation points, and I signed my name on the clipboard for legal clinic hours, and I waited. With a small parade of lives, an elegant woman in a navy turban whose hands trembled but whose rings did not, a man in a veteran's cap arguing gently with his knees, a couple who sat too close to be casual and not close enough to be married, and when the volunteer called Marianne, I stood without the little apology I used to tuck into my posture and followed her down a corridor that smelled like hand soap and coffee, where an attorney with soft, serious eyes asked how she could help, and I told her plainly that someone who shared my last name had begun rearranging the furniture of my legal standing in my absence, and I intended to return it to its place and bolt it to the floor. And she smiled in that quick, private way people do when the truth gives them something clean to hold. Then she drafted a revocation of any power of attorney not signed in ink on this day in this room, a statement of capacity, a letter instructing agencies to disregard requests not sent from my address, and she slid them across the table with a pen that wrote like butter but left a line like a verdict, and I signed again, slower this time, because ritual matters, and because there is a difference between the decision and the moment the world begins to recognize it. When I stepped back outside, the light had changed. The day had taken off the soft cardigan of morning and put on a jacket with structure, and I decided to walk rather than wait for the bus, because I needed my body to participate in the decision my mind had made. So I moved along the storefronts and the small trees that try too hard in their square plots, and I passed a thrift shop where the window displayed a crooked congregation of teacups and picture frames and a brass lamp with more optimism than wiring, and a shallow dish glazed the color of a winter sky caught my eye, the kind of dish that doesn't specialize in anything and therefore can hold almost everything. And I went inside and bought it for $3.50 and carried it out as if it were something fragile delivered by a long journey, which I suppose it was, because I already knew it would live by my door, like a quiet altar where my new card and my keys could rest each night, under the small, watchful agreement I was making with myself, an agreement that said, no more hiding your life from your own life. Back at home, I cleared the table, the polite clutter of magazines and coupons, and the lonely salt shaker that had outlived its pair, and I arranged my papers into a binder with sections and tabs, and the unembarrassed orderliness of a woman who has stopped confusing chaos with fate. Then I called the utility company and listened to the confetti music of their hold line until a human arrived, and I explained, without pleading and without ornament, that the account holder is me, that the address of record is here, that automatic payments would resume from my new account, and that any future requests initiated by a third party should be referred back to me for approval. And the representative repeated my words in her own, which is how institutions show they have heard you, and I thanked her and wrote the confirmation number in ink that does not apologize for being permanent. I made a sandwich I could eat without thinking, and then I thought while I ate it about how many hours of my life I had donated to gracious silence, about the religion of pleasing, and how I had tithed to it with both hands, and I looked around my little apartment, the plant that refuses to die, the chair with good bones masquerading as shabby, the crooked print of a harbor at dusk, and I realized none of it was waiting for someone else's approval to be enough. So I took the phone from its cradle and called the doctor's office to schedule my own ride for next week. And when the receptionist offered to text Daniel as a courtesy, I said very gently that there would be no courtesy like that anymore, because I was revising my list of who needed to know what about me and when. And she laughed softly and said she understood. And I believed her because it felt like a secret handshake between women who do not look like conspirators and therefore can be. In the afternoon, I wrote 3 letters on cream paper that had waited too long in the drawer. One to Daniel, concise and without a single word sharpened into a blade, informing him of the closures and reassignments and of my willingness to communicate about family, not finances. One to Lisa, colder but still human, enclosing copies for her records, and a sentence that said, I expect accuracy to replace performance. And one to myself, which I dated and signed and sealed because it deserved ceremony, promising that fear would no longer serve as my foreman, and that every request for help would be measured against dignity, rather than the comfort of those who prefer me quiet. And I addressed the first 2 and set them by the door, and I slipped the third into the binder's front pocket, so that any time I opened it, the first thing I would see would be my own name spoken back to me by my own hand. Evening stretched its gentle net over the building, catching the day's noise and letting it go with the patience of a tide. And I took the new dish and placed it on the small table by the door, and I put my keys in it, and then the new card, and then, because I am sentimental when no one is watching, I added the little brass button from my late husband's coat that I keep for luck, and the dish looked suddenly like a modest constellation I could navigate by, and I sat in the armchair and breathed, the slow, deep breath of someone who has moved a piece on the board that cannot be moved back without cost. And I opened the binder and reviewed the copies of the revocations and the receipts and the confirmation numbers until the administrative music of it steadied me. And somewhere between page dividers, I realized a strange and necessary thing, which is that love does not require me to be manageable, and that the first tenderness I owe my son is the one that refuses to assist his worst habits. The phone stayed quiet until almost 9, when a number I knew too well appeared, and I let it ring while I watched it, the way you watch weather from a window, not because you can command it, but because it is honest to see what approaches and when. Voicemail took the call. His voice arrived subdued, strangely boyish, saying he'd heard from the bank and from Angela at Senior Services and from Lisa, who was apparently furious, and he said he didn't understand why I was doing this. And I answered, without answering by doing nothing, because silence is also an instrument, and I was learning to play it with intention rather than shame. And after the beep, I did not speak, and I set the phone down in the dish on top of the card, and the keys, and the button, and the small weight of all that ordinary metal and plastic and brass felt like a ledger rewritten from debit to credit. And I thought, quietly and with no triumph, that the midpoint of a life is not a year, but a moment when the balance shifts from being arranged to arranging, from being held to holding, from being managed to managing. And I turned off the lamp and went to bed with the window open to let the night come in and find me where I was, which was here, in a room I could afford under a roof I had chosen, protected by the single inconvenient fact that I was no longer asking to be saved in order to be allowed to live. It was a week later when the quiet began to feel unnatural again, the kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace but to plotting, like the pause before a verdict is read aloud. I had started to believe that maybe they had accepted the situation. Maybe they had finally seen that what I'd done was not rebellion, but simple reclamation. I had begun to walk differently, straighter, slower, with a kind of measured dignity that comes from being accountable only to yourself. I was learning the rhythm of solitude without apology, filling my days with small rituals that felt like acts of survival disguised as chores, watering the plant on the balcony that leaned stubbornly toward the sun, ironing pillowcases no one else would ever see, writing in the small blue notebook I had bought from the thrift shop for $1.50, where I recorded not thoughts exactly, but confirmations that I was still here, that I existed in my own handwriting. And then, just as the air had started to loosen around me, the phone rang at dawn. It wasn't Daniel this time. It was Lisa. Her voice was quiet, cautious, threaded with something brittle, like glass under pressure. She said she thought we should talk, that she could come by later that day, that Daniel was out of town for business, and perhaps it would be good for both of us to clear the air. I said yes, because I wanted to see what kind of woman she was when her husband wasn't listening from another room. After we hung up, I sat at the table and stared at the steam rising from my cup until it became invisible, and I thought about how many conversations between women never truly begin, because one of them is protecting the comfort of a man. When she arrived that afternoon, she was dressed differently. No soft fabrics, no polished ease, just jeans and a sweater too heavy for the weather. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of someone else's decisions had been resting on her shoulders for too long. She stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain whether she was entering enemy territory or refuge. I gestured for her to come in. She sat, folded her hands, and said, "He told me you closed the account." I said, "I did." She nodded once, as though ticking off a line in a report. "He's furious," she said. "He feels like you don't trust him." I wanted to ask her if she truly believed that was the worst thing I had taken from him, but I only said, "Trust is earned by honesty, not inheritance." She looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring was a perfect circle, too tight, leaving a faint mark on her skin. "I know about the transfers," she said finally. "The ones from your account to his. I didn't know before. He told me it was a business arrangement with your approval." I should have asked. I didn't. She paused, then met my eyes. "You were right to send the statement." The words hung in the room like a strange kind of confession. For a moment, I saw the girl she must have been once, the one who probably thought marriage meant partnership rather than negotiation, who believed a husband's version of events could be trusted without verification. There was something fragile and brave in her admitting it to me, and I felt a flicker of pity I hadn't expected to feel for her. But then she continued, her tone shifting slightly, as though she had rehearsed the next part. "He's worried you'll complicate things. He's been talking about consolidating the family finances, making sure everything's streamlined, so there aren't misunderstandings in the future. He says you're getting paranoid, that maybe you're reading too much into things." She looked away when she said it, as if she could already feel the ugliness of the words before they finished leaving her mouth. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted the silence to stretch, to remind her that what she had just said wasn't harmless. It was participation. Finally, I asked, And do you believe that? She hesitated, and I saw the truth flicker behind her eyes before she buried it again under the practiced loyalty of a wife. I think you've been hurt, she said carefully, and I think Daniel doesn't know how to handle that. It was almost impressive, the symmetry of their logic. His betrayal translated into my fragility, his theft into my confusion, his deceit into my grief. I am not hurt, I said. I am awake. She exhaled softly, almost like a sigh of defeat. You sound like him, she murmured. I almost laughed. Then maybe that's the only thing we have in common. When she left, she hugged me, an awkward, half-hearted gesture that tried to disguise itself as reconciliation, but was really just self-preservation. I could smell her perfume, faint and expensive, something floral that didn't belong to sincerity. After she closed the door, I stood there for a long time, my cheeks still cold from where her hair had brushed against it. I realized that she hadn't come to comfort me or even to scold me. She had come to measure the damage, to assess whether I was still a manageable variable in their well-ordered life. And in that calculation, she had found something dangerous, that I was no longer predictable. That evening, I went through my papers again, methodically, almost ritualistically. I reread the legal letters, the confirmations, the receipts, the copies of the emails I had sent. I made a note to contact the pension office just to confirm that all direct deposits now went into my new account. When I called the number and verified the details, the woman on the line told me, almost casually, that there had been an attempt to update my beneficiary information earlier that week, but that it had been denied because my signature didn't match. It happens all the time, she said cheerfully. Maybe your son just mixed up the forms. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there in the growing dark. I didn't turn on the lamp. I wanted to feel the depth of that darkness, to let it teach me what kind of enemy I was actually dealing with. The next day, I went to see the lawyer again, the same woman with soft eyes and firm hands. I told her what had happened, and she pursed her lips, not in surprise, but in recognition. It's not uncommon, she said. Family members assume rights that don't exist. We can make it clear, again, that any such actions will be contested. I can draft an affidavit stating you're of sound mind and fully capable of managing your own affairs. I said yes. She wrote it up while I sat there, the sound of her pen steady as a metronome. When she handed it to me, I read it twice before signing. The language was dry, bureaucratic, but beneath it pulsed something holy, the declaration of one's own consciousness. Later, as I walked home, a breeze lifted the edges of my hair, and I felt almost weightless. It wasn't triumph. It was the relief of clarity, the peace of a woman who has finally accepted that she is not loved in the way she deserves, and that the absence of such love no longer requires her to shrink. I stopped at the park, sat on a bench, and watched children chase each other through the grass. Their laughter reached me in waves, bright and careless. I remembered Daniel at that age, knees scabbed, pockets full of marbles, shouting my name across the street because he wanted me to see him, to witness his joy. That boy had trusted me completely. And somehow, over the decades, that trust had been replaced by contempt disguised as protection. I realized then that the cruelty of age is not weakness itself, but the way others reinterpret your strength as incompetence once it no longer serves them. That night, as I washed the dishes, the phone rang again. I let it ring, but the sound felt heavier this time, as if it were vibrating through the walls. When it stopped, I glanced at the caller ID. Daniel, of course. Then a minute later, it rang again. And again. Finally, I answered. Not because I wanted to hear him, but because I was tired of him trying to fill my silence. His voice was cold, sharp, the voice of a man who believes his power has been unfairly questioned. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. "You're turning everyone against me. Lisa barely talks to me now, and the lawyer says you filed something against me. You're making a mess." I didn't say anything at first. I wanted him to hear his own panic. "I didn't turn anyone against you," I said finally. "I just stopped covering for you." He exhaled sharply. "You've lost it, Mom. You don't even know what's real anymore." I laughed then, a sound that startled even me. "That's rich, Daniel, coming from someone who spent his entire adult life inventing reality for other people." He went quiet. I could hear him breathing, that deep, irritated inhale he'd inherited from his father. "You're going to regret this," he said at last. "You can't handle things alone." I said very calmly, "Then I will fail on my own terms." There was another long silence, and then the click of him hanging up. I stood there holding the receiver until the dial tone turned into a hum. I put it down, dried my hands, and turned off the kitchen light. The window above the sink reflected my face back to me. Older, yes, but steady, unflinching. I realized I didn't look afraid anymore. I looked awake. In the days that followed, small retaliations began to appear. My mailbox overflowed with unsolicited pamphlets about assisted living facilities, all addressed to me, but obviously sent by someone who knew too much about my circumstances. A representative from a wellness coordination service called, saying my son had referred me for evaluation. My landlord mentioned, almost apologetically, that Daniel had called asking about the safety of the building, about whether there were rails in the bathroom, about whether tenants like me needed extra supervision. It was humiliating, infuriating, and darkly predictable. When you refuse to play the part written for you, they start to rewrite the script around your resistance, but I refused to audition anymore. I called the wellness coordinator back and told her there was no need to schedule a visit, that the only supervision required in my life was my own. She seemed unsure what to say. "We just like to make sure our seniors are safe," she said finally. "I am," I replied, "from everyone but my son." There was a pause, long enough for her to understand what that meant. She cleared her throat, said she would update the file, and hung up. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. When I woke, I opened the blinds and let the morning flood in. The world outside looked ordinary, indifferent, alive. I brewed coffee, took my mug to the small balcony, and watched a young couple from the building across the street argue, and then laugh, and then kiss, the way people do when they still believe love will save them from becoming strangers. I wished them well, and I meant it, but the world wasn't done testing me. 2 days later, I received a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice. Daniel had initiated a request to become my financial custodian on grounds of diminished capacity. It wasn't formal yet, just an intent, a warning shot dressed in polite legal language. I sat very still while reading it, then read it again, slower this time. The words were cruelly civil. They described me not as a woman, but as a case file, a potential liability, a person to be managed. I felt a pulse in my throat, not from fear, but from the deep, almost physical recognition that something irreversible had just begun. He wasn't just trying to control me anymore. He was trying to erase me officially. For a long while, I didn't move. The light shifted across the floor, tracing the hours I spent sitting there thinking. I thought about all the years I had spent believing that family was a kind of safety net, not realizing that sometimes the net is there to catch you, and sometimes it's there to hold you down. I thought about the countless ways women are taught to equate endurance with virtue, silence with grace. And then I thought about the small blue notebook on the counter where I had written every confirmation, every detail, every date. I rose, retrieved it, opened to the first page, and wrote in large, deliberate letters, "He has declared war. I will respond with truth." Then I picked up the phone and called the lawyer. My voice didn't shake when I said my name. I told her about the letter, and she said to come in the next morning. I thanked her, hung up, and felt something deep and steady settle inside me. Whatever happened next, it would not be quiet. It would not be hidden. I would not fade into the background of my own life again. The escalation wasn't his. It was mine. The morning of the hearing began with the kind of light that refuses to be dramatic, a flat, honest brightness that makes every surface visible without mercy. And I took that as a sign that I should be visible too, not as a mother, not as a supplicant, but as a woman whose life had a legal perimeter and a center that belonged to her alone. So I dressed in the navy dress I kept for graduations and funerals and interviews, the one that makes my back remember it is capable of strategy, and I set my binder, my ID, and the letters the lawyer and I had prepared into the thrifted bag with the sturdy strap. Then I placed the small winter sky dish on the table and rested my keys and my new card inside it, as if leaving witnesses behind, and I locked the door with the calm of a person who knows it will be she, and not a committee of relatives, who decides when she returns. The courthouse was colder than the weather had earned, all stone and aspiration, a building that believes in judgment as a form of architecture. And when I stepped through the metal detector, the guard looked at me with the faint, careful kindness reserved for grandmothers and ghosts, and I smiled back because I had chosen neither role today. My lawyer met me by the elevators, hair pinned, voice steady, a folder under her arm labeled with my name in ink that would outlast gossip. And she guided me to a small conference room where the long table could have held a family dinner, if families. Ate deliberation for dessert, and she said we would keep the record clean, that we would insist on memory with receipts, that we would let the quiet do some of the talking, because quiet, when chosen, sounds like control. They arrived together, of course, Daniel and Lisa, both looking slightly smaller than their clothes, the way people do when righteousness has been tailored one size too big, and Daniel tried a smile that landed on the table like a dull coin, and he asked if we could be reasonable and work this out without making a scene. And I told him that scenes are what people build when they refuse to recognize a life as a room with a door, that I had no interest in drama, only in documents, and I watched. His mouth tightened because documents do not negotiate with tone. The clerk called us in, the judge spoke our names in a register that made them equal, and the petition, his petition, was read aloud in a voice that could have been reading a grocery list for all the emotion it allowed, and it described me as drifting, forgetful, financially compromised, a woman who needed to be saved from herself by a son whom the law should deputize for the task. And as the words stacked up like a neat insult, I felt the strangest ease, because what the petition could not imagine was seated at that table, holding a blue ink pen and a binder tabbed like a small city. And when it was our turn, my lawyer placed in front of the court an affidavit of capacity signed yesterday, a revocation of any prior delegations, a timeline of bank actions with dates and amounts, and the tiny audacity of proof. And she did not raise her voice once, because paper does not require volume to be heard. The judge asked me whether I understood what I had signed, whether I knew the difference between assistance and authority, whether I had anyone I wished to appoint in my stead should the day come when the border between intention and ability blurred. And I answered without ceremony that I understood all of it, that assistance was a cup of water brought when requested, and authority was a hand on the back of your neck, that today I preferred the water and not the hand, and that I had executed new directives naming a professional fiduciary, not a relative, to step in if a doctor, not a son, determined I could not manage, and I saw a flicker of respect cross the judge's face like a bird skimming water, gone as quickly as it arrived, but real, enough to make a sound. Daniel tried to speak of love then, the way people do when numbers and dates have betrayed them. He said he feared for me. He said I was vulnerable to scams. He said Lisa had found brochures in my mailbox that proved it, and I almost laughed because the only scam that had touched my door wore our last name, and when my lawyer gently asked whether he had ever transferred funds from the joint account without my explicit consent, he said the word reimbursement as if it were a blessing, and the judge lifted an eyebrow in that way professionals have of placing a hand on the conversation without touching it. There is a specific quiet that happens while a judge reads and rereads a page, and in that quiet you can hear your history breathe, and I let mine inhale every time I had been told to wait, to be grateful, to stop asking, and I exhaled all of it in a single steady breath that did not move the paper on the table. And then the judge spoke in sentences that were careful not to be memorable, and those sentences said the petition was denied, that the court had no evidence to support a finding of diminished capacity, that any further attempts to alter my access or status without my consent could constitute harassment or fraud, and that while family conflict was unfortunate, autonomy was not a popularity contest. And I nodded because the law had put a frame around the picture I had been carrying in my pocket for months. It did not end there, of course, because paper is a beginning disguised as an ending. So when we returned to the corridor, my lawyer handed me a small stack of certified letters already addressed and ready to be mailed the moment we left. One to the pension office, one to my landlord, one to the credit union, one to the senior services coordinator, each of them enclosing the order and the affidavits, each of them a pebble in the river of their systems, changing the current not by noise, but by physics. Daniel stood in the hallway with a look I had only seen once before, the day he learned that the world would not always applaud him for arriving, and he said he hadn't meant it to go this far, that he had been scared, that men are told to take charge, and he had, and I told him men are told many things, and not all of them are instructions worth following, and that I had been scared too, but I had chosen to be exact rather than loud, and that from here on we would speak through letters about money, and we could speak as people about weather, books, or the baby, but not in the old crooked language where help meant surrender, and he said I was cruel, and I said I was done. Lisa touched his sleeve like a cue, but she looked at me with something like exhausted relief, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if she would ever forgive me for the gift I had just given her, which was the removal of a lie from the center of her marriage, because sometimes the truth is a scalpel, and sometimes it is a bandage, and often it is both in the same hour. We left the courthouse, my lawyer on to her next life to steady, me to the post office, where I mailed those letters one by one, the clerk stamping each envelope with a sound like a small finality, and then I walked home, because I needed my feet to understand what my hand had done. And I stopped by the thrift store without intending to, and found behind a stack of chipped plates a small wooden frame with a crack at one corner that made it perfect, and I bought it for $1.50 and carried it under my arm like a diploma. At home, I set the frame on the table, took a sheet of paper, and wrote in the largest, kindest handwriting I could manage a sentence so plain it felt like breath. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a person to be respected. Then I slid the sentence into the frame and placed it by the door behind the dish, so that every arrival and every departure would pass under that simple jurisdiction. After that, I dialed the number of the local police precinct and filed an informational report about attempted identity changes, not because I believed they would need it, but because I wanted a timestamp in a ledger that did not belong to family or bank or court. And when the officer on the other end said it was wise to document, I felt the odd warmth of being treated not as fragile or theatrical, but as merely competent. There was one more letter to write, and I knew it could not be the kind that tries to win or wound, because victory and injury are different masks with the same elastic. So I took the cream paper and addressed Daniel directly, telling him I had filed a new will, leaving small legacies to people who had stood beside me without requesting a script, gifts to the library, to the clinic where I once took midnight calls, to a fund for women who need a cab rather than a sermon, and that I had appointed a neutral fiduciary for anything that outlived me, because love should not be asked to perform accounting after a funeral. And I said I wished him a life where help was an offering and not a leash, and I did not sign it, Mom. I signed it with my full name and dated it in ink dark enough to be read by strangers. I copied the letter from my records, sealed his, and set it with the others already moving through the postal veins of the city. That night, the apartment wore quiet like a well-tailored coat, and I stood by the door and touched the frame and the dish and the cool metal of my keys. And I understood that nothing spectacular had happened in the way movies understand spectacle. No shouting in the rain, no dramatic disowning, no public repentance, only a structure built from paper and choice, and the stubborn refusal to be misunderstood by design. And I knew I had done something that could not be undone without consequence. Not because a judge had said so, but because I had. And I felt the slow rearrangement of my bones into a posture I recognized from an earlier life, before pleasing became policy. And I went to the window and opened it and let the night come in on its own terms. And I whispered, because I wanted to hear it out loud, and because hearing is a kind of law of its own. This is mine, this day, this door, this name. And the room acknowledged me the way rooms do when you finally occupy them with your whole weight. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of unremarkable gentleness that at first felt almost suspicious, as if the world were trying to see whether I would really live without the noise that had surrounded me for so long, whether I could exist in a rhythm that belonged entirely to my own choosing. Morning light began to arrive differently, not as an intrusion, but as an invitation, slow and patient, spreading itself across the small kitchen table where I now took breakfast in silence, reading the paper with the same deliberate focus I once reserved for scanning a child's face for signs of fever or trouble. It was astonishing how much time was released into a day once no one was expecting explanations. I still kept the binder close, stacked neatly on the shelf by the window, not because I anticipated a new attack, but because its presence steadied me. It was proof that I had translated fear into form, that I had taken all the things meant to confuse me and turned them into order. Sometimes I would run a finger along its spine, the way one might touch a scar to confirm that healing had in fact taken place, and each time it felt a little less like a wound and a little more like armor. Daniel did not call again, though one afternoon a letter arrived, thin, typed, unsigned except for his initials, saying that he hoped we could find peace and that he had not meant to hurt me. It was written in the cautious, generic tone of a man who wants credit for civility without the risk of vulnerability. I read it once and then placed it in the folder, not under correspondence, but in the section I had labeled completed matters. I didn't hate him, though hatred might have been easier. I simply no longer arranged my emotional furniture around him. I had learned that indifference, when earned, is not cruelty. It is freedom from the kind of loyalty that demands self-erasure. Lisa wrote, too, weeks later, a softer letter that rambled between apology and justification, saying she missed the baby's laughter in my apartment and that she had never truly understood what Daniel had been doing with the money. She ended with the line, "I hope one day she will know how much you loved her." I believed that was the truest sentence she had ever written. I wrote back only to say that she could bring the child to visit any time, that my door was open, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as proof that generosity and submission are not the same thing. The first time Lisa brought her, the little girl toddled across the floor, toward the dish by the door, and lifted the brass button from it, holding it up like a treasure. I told her it came from her grandfather's coat, and she looked at it with solemn wonder before placing it back carefully. It felt like a benediction, a quiet restoration that required no words. After they left, I stood for a long time in the doorway, watching their figures recede down the walkway, the small hand clutching the larger one, and I felt something settle in me that was not triumph, but understanding, that survival is not always loud, that sometimes it looks like a woman standing in her own doorway without asking for permission to do so. I began to walk more in the evenings, through the park where I had once sat, counting betrayals. Now I counted lights, windows, lampposts, the glow from bicycles as they curved along the path. And in that simple arithmetic of illumination, I found a peace I hadn't known I'd been seeking. I discovered that solitude, when chosen, expands the world rather than shrinking it. I started volunteering at the senior center on Thursdays, helping others fill out the very forms that had once frightened me. There was something redemptive in guiding other hands through bureaucratic sentences, watching fear turn into comprehension. One woman, whose son had taken her name off her lease, squeezed my hand and said, "You sound like someone who knows." I smiled and told her knowing is the least we owe each other. At home, I began rearranging things, not dramatically, just small shifts, as if to reflect the internal realignment that had already happened. I moved the chair closer to the window, hung the harbor print straighter, replaced the burned-out bulbs, and finally put my own name on the mailbox in clean, steady letters. Every change was a sentence in the story I was still writing, the story that no longer required approval to continue. Sometimes at night, I would sit by the window with the lamp turned low and look at the framed sentence by the door. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a person to be respected. And it no longer read like defiance. It read like description, factual and calm, the way one might state the weather. I thought often about the girl I had been, the young wife and mother who believed that endurance was proof of love, who mistook silence for strength because no one ever taught her that boundaries could be tender. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her that help is not a sin and independence is not a punishment, that being needed is not the same as being valued, and that the day will come when she must choose between being agreeable and being whole. I would tell her to choose wholeness every time. I suppose, in a way, that's what I'm doing now, speaking across time to every version of myself that once believed she had to earn her own existence. The apartment smells faintly of jasmine from the candle I light at dusk, a scent that has begun to mean peace rather than nostalgia. The dish by the door holds my keys, my card, and the brass button. Beside it stands the framed sentence, and, leaning against the wall, a small photograph of my younger self, with Daniel as a boy, both of us squinting into the sun, unaware of the long education ahead of us in love's more complicated grammar. I don't hide the photo or worship it. It simply stays there, a record of something that was real and therefore worthy of neither denial nor regret. Sometimes when I wake at night and the city has gone silent, I listen to the steady rhythm of my own breathing and realize that for the first time in many years, I am not waiting for a call, for forgiveness, for recognition. The air feels balanced around me, as if every molecule has accepted my right to occupy this space. There is no dramatic finale, no closing statement. Life simply continues, but differently, more honestly. Tomorrow I will water the plant, meet the lawyer for coffee just because we enjoy each other's company now, and stop by the thrift shop to look for nothing in particular. The rest of my days, however many they may be, will be spent in this quiet kind of ownership, where every gesture, every breath belongs to me. If another woman, somewhere, should ever find herself told that asking for help makes her weak, I hope she will remember there was once an old woman who was told the same thing, who refused to disappear, who took the insult and turned it into a map, leading back to herself. And if she ever doubts the value of her own persistence, she should know that somewhere, in a modest apartment with a single window and a dish by the door, another woman learned that dignity is not a gift to be granted, but a habit to be practiced every day until it becomes indistinguishable from breathing.